The late afternoon sun cast a warm glow over Riverside Park, illuminating the lush greenery and creating a serene atmosphere that enveloped Marcus Davis as he sat on a weathered bench. He turned a page in the book he was reading, momentarily losing himself in the quiet rustle of leaves and the distant laughter of children playing. Across the park, Officer Brian Harkins patrolled the area, his sharp eyes scanning the surroundings. He had walked this beat for over 2 decades, and in his mind he knew this city better than anyone. When he noticed Marcus sitting alone on the bench, something in his gut stirred, a feeling he had learned to trust over the years. "Never seen him around here before," Brian muttered under his breath. He stopped walking and watched Marcus for a moment, trying to place the feeling. There had been reports of a suspect fitting a general description that matched Marcus, a vague, flimsy lead, but it was enough for Brian. Marcus felt the weight of someone's gaze and looked up from his book. He noticed Brian standing a distance away, staring at him with a look that was all too familiar. Marcus had been in situations like this before. He could read the officer's expression easily, prejudice masquerading as concern, a suspicion that had no basis other than the color of his skin. But Marcus didn't flinch. Instead, he closed his book slowly, marking the page with a finger, and met Brian's gaze. Brian's grip on his baton tightened. He saw the way Marcus looked at him, steady, unafraid. It unnerved him. "Let's see what this guy's up to," Brian muttered as he started walking toward Marcus, his posture stiffening with each step. He didn't like how Marcus was looking at him, didn't like the calmness, the lack of fear. It was unsettling. Marcus watched Brian approach, keeping his expression neutral. He knew what was coming and had seen it many times before. The situation was already loaded, and he knew that how he responded in the next few moments could determine how it played out. He wasn't in the mood for this today, but he also wasn't going to give the officer any reason to escalate the situation. "Afternoon," Brian said as he reached the bench, his tone polite but with an edge. Marcus could hear the underlying suspicion. "Afternoon," Marcus replied, his voice calm and even. He kept his hands visible, resting them on the closed book in his lap. "What brings you out here today?" Brian asked, his eyes scanning Marcus's face, then flicking to the book. He was fishing for something, anything, to justify the feeling gnawing at him. "Just enjoying the park," Marcus said. "It's a nice day." Brian nodded slowly, though he wasn't really listening. He was more interested in what Marcus wasn't saying, in what he could dig out from beneath the surface. "You from around here?" Marcus smiled slightly, though it didn't reach his eyes. "I've been around." The non-answer didn't sit well with Brian. He shifted his weight, his stance becoming more confrontational. "Mind if I see some ID?" Marcus's smile faded. This was the point where things could go sideways. He knew his rights, knew he wasn't obligated to show ID just for sitting in a public park. But he also knew that refusing could escalate the situation quickly. Still, he wasn't going to let this officer intimidate him. "Am I under arrest?" Marcus asked, his tone measured. He met Brian's gaze without flinching. Brian bristled at the question. There was that calmness again, that refusal to be intimidated. It made him uneasy, made him feel like he was losing control of the situation. "You will be if you don't cooperate," Brian shot back, his hand moving to rest on his holster. Marcus took a slow breath, keeping his expression neutral. He didn't like where this was heading, but he wasn't going to back down. "I'm just sitting in a park," he said, his voice steady. "Is there a law against that?" Brian's patience was wearing thin. "You fit the description of someone we're looking for," he said, though even he knew how weak the excuse sounded. He stepped closer, looming over Marcus. Marcus didn't move. He held Brian's gaze, refusing to give him the reaction he was looking for. "And what description is that?" Marcus asked quietly. Brian's jaw tightened. He didn't have a good answer, and he knew it. But admitting that would mean losing faith, losing control. He wasn't about to let that happen. "Don't get smart with me," he snapped. "Show me some ID now." For a moment, the two men locked eyes, the tension thickening between them. Marcus knew he could push back and assert his rights, but he also knew that doing so could make this situation even more dangerous. He decided to comply for now. Without a word, he reached into his pocket slowly, deliberately, and pulled out his wallet. Brian watched every movement closely, his body coiled like a spring. When Marcus handed over his ID, Brian snatched it out of his hand and glanced at it. The name didn't mean anything to him, but that didn't matter, he'd already made up his mind. "Stand up," Brian ordered, stepping back to give Marcus room. Marcus sighed inwardly but did as he was told, rising slowly from the bench. He kept his hands visible, not wanting to give Brian any reason to claim he felt threatened. "Turn around," Brian said, pulling out a pair of handcuffs. Marcus felt a surge of frustration but pushed it down. He turned around, letting Brian cuff him without resistance. He could hear people nearby, could feel their eyes on him, but he stayed calm, knowing that the worst thing he could do now was give in to anger. As Brian tightened the cuffs around Marcus's wrists, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was off, that he was making a mistake. But his pride wouldn't let him stop now. He grabbed Marcus's arm and started leading him toward the patrol car parked nearby. Marcus didn't say a word as they walked, his mind already shifting to what would come next. He wasn't worried about himself. He knew who he was, knew that this officer would find out soon enough. But he couldn't help but feel a deep weariness, a tiredness that went beyond this one encounter. It was the exhaustion of knowing that despite all his accomplishments, all his efforts, he was still seen as just another black man in the eyes of too many people like Officer Brian Harkins. As they reached the patrol car, Brian opened the back door and guided Marcus inside. The tension still hung in the air. Marcus settled into the seat, the cold metal of the handcuffs biting into his wrists. He looked out the window as the car pulled away from the park, watching the trees blur past, wondering how this day, like so many others, had gone so wrong. The patrol car's engine hummed as Officer Brian Harkins drove Marcus Davis toward the precinct. Brian's grip on the steering wheel was tight, his knuckles white as he processed what had just happened. He didn't like the way Marcus had looked at him back there in the park, calm, unafraid, like he knew something Brian did. It gnawed at him, made him question his instincts. But his pride wouldn't let him admit that. Marcus sat quietly in the back seat, his hands cuffed behind him. The city streets blurred by, but his mind wasn't on the passing scenery. Instead, he was focused on what would happen next. He knew the system, knew how quickly things could escalate if he wasn't careful. But he also knew his own power, the authority that came with his position, an authority that Officer Harkin had no idea about. As they neared the precinct, Brian glanced at Marcus in the rearview mirror. "What were you really doing in that park?" he asked, his voice edged with suspicion. Marcus met Brian's eyes in the mirror, his expression unreadable. "I told you," he replied calmly. "I was just reading." Brian scoffed. "A guy like you just sitting around reading? You expect me to believe that?" Marcus raised an eyebrow. "A guy like me?" he repeated, his tone measured. Brian hesitated for a moment, realizing the slip in his words. But instead of backing down, he doubled down. "You don't look like someone who spends his afternoons reading in the park." Marcus didn't respond immediately. He let the silence stretch, the tension in the car thickening. When he finally spoke, his voice was cool and controlled. "And what does someone like me look like, officer?" Brian didn't answer. He couldn't. He knew what he was implying, knew how it sounded. But he wasn't about to admit that to Marcus or to himself. Instead, he focused on driving, his frustration mounting as Marcus's calm demeanor continued to unsettle him. The car pulled into the precinct's parking lot. Brian parked near the entrance, got out first, then opened the back door and helped Marcus out, the cuffs still digging into Marcus's wrists as they walked toward the building. Brian's thoughts raced. He needed to figure out what to do next. This wasn't how arrests were supposed to go. The suspect was supposed to be scared, compliant, not composed and challenging him with every word. Inside the precinct, the usual buzz of activity filled the air. Officers filing reports, phones ringing, the hum of conversation. Brian led Marcus through the main hall, ignoring the curious glances from other officers. He didn't want to explain himself just yet, not until he was sure of his next move. They reached the booking area, and Brian signaled for Marcus to stand by the processing desk. The officer behind the desk, a young man named Officer Jenkins, looked up, surprised to see Brian bringing someone in. "What's this about?" Jenkins asked, his eyes flicking to Marcus, then back to Brian. "Caught this guy in the park," Brian replied, his tone clipped. He was acting suspicious, wouldn't cooperate when I asked for ID. Captain Bennett's gaze shifted to Marcus, and for a split second, there was a flicker of recognition, just like Jenkins, but she quickly masked it, her expression turning professional. Is that so? She said, her voice even. Marcus met her eyes and saw the recognition there. He knew that Captain Bennett was aware of who he was, but she was playing it carefully, waiting to see how Brian would handle the situation. That's right, Brian continued, oblivious to the silent exchange between Marcus and Bennett. I brought him in for questioning, Captain. Bennett nodded slowly, her eyes narrowing slightly. I see. And did you have probable cause to arrest him? Brian hesitated, feeling the ground beneath him start to shift. He was acting suspiciously, he said, though it sounded weaker this time. Captain Bennett leaned back in her chair, studying Brian carefully. Officer Harkin, why don't you step outside for a moment? I'd like to speak with Mr. Davis alone. Brian blinked, taken aback by the request, but Captain Bennett's tone left no room for argument. Reluctantly, Brian released Marcus and stepped out of the office, closing the door behind him. As soon as he was gone, Captain Bennett's demeanor shifted slightly, becoming less formal. Mr. Davis, she said, her voice calm, I apologize for this misunderstanding. Marcus allowed himself a small smile. No need to apologize, Captain. You're just doing your job. Bennett sighed, glancing at the closed door. I'm aware of who you are, but I'd appreciate if we kept that under wraps for now. I need to handle this situation carefully. Marcus nodded. Of course. I'm not here to cause trouble, Captain. I just want to make sure things are handled properly. They will be, Bennett assured him. I'll speak with Officer Harkin and deal with this appropriately. But I have to ask, why didn't you just tell him who you are? Marcus's smile faded, replaced by a more serious expression. Because it shouldn't matter, Captain. My identity shouldn't be the reason he decides to treat me with respect. Captain Bennett considered his words, then nodded in understanding. You're right. It shouldn't matter. But unfortunately, it does to some people. The room fell silent for a moment, the weight of the situation hanging in the air. Finally, Captain Bennett stood up. I'll call Officer Harkin back in. We'll resolve this. Marcus nodded again, watching as Captain Bennett moved to the door. The confrontation wasn't over, but he knew he had the upper hand now. The truth would come out soon enough, and Officer Harkin would have to face the consequences of his actions. As Captain Bennett opened the door, Brian stepped back inside, his expression wary. He could sense that something had shifted, but he didn't know what. He glanced at Marcus, who stood calmly waiting. Mr. Davis here is not the man you were looking for. You'll release him immediately. Brian blinked, the words taking a moment to sink in. What? But Captain? Immediately, Officer Bennett repeated, her voice leaving no room for argument. Reluctantly, Brian released Marcus and stepped back. Marcus nodded and turned to Captain Bennett. I'll be in touch, Captain, he said quietly. There's still a lot to discuss. Captain Bennett nodded in return, understanding the weight behind his words. I look forward to it, Mr. Davis. With that, Marcus walked out of the office, leaving Brian standing there, a sinking feeling in his gut. The confrontation was over, but the consequences were only beginning. Brian Harkin sat at his desk in the precinct, the tension in his body refusing to dissipate. He had barely been able to concentrate since Captain Bennett had released Marcus Davis. The unease gnawed at him, deepened by the fact that he still didn't understand what had just happened. He knew he had made a mistake, but the full extent of it was still out of reach. The silence of the precinct around him was both comforting and unnerving, a space for his thoughts to spiral. Suddenly, the sound of footsteps approaching his desk snapped him out of his reverie. He looked up to see Captain Bennett walking toward him, her expression serious. Brian's stomach tightened. He knew this wasn't going to be a casual conversation. Officer Harkins, my office now, Captain Bennett said, her tone leaving no room for argument. Brian stood up immediately, trying to suppress the nervousness that was beginning to creep into his demeanor. He followed her to the office, each step feeling heavier than the last. Once inside, Captain Bennett closed the door behind him and gestured for him to sit. Brian hesitated for a moment before sitting down. He could feel the tension in the room, the unspoken weight of what was coming. "Officer Harkins," Bennett began, her tone measured but stern, "do you have any idea who Marcus Davis is?" Brian shook his head, his confusion deepening. "No, Captain. Just some guy in the park." "Officer Harkins," Bennett said, leaning forward, her gaze never leaving Brian's. "Marcus Davis isn't just some guy in the park. He's a special agent, one of their top agents, in fact." The words hit Brian like a physical blow. His eyes widened in shock, the implications of what he had done crashing down on him. "An FBI agent?" he repeated, his voice barely above a whisper. "That's right," Bennett said, her voice firm. "And more than that, he's highly respected within the Bureau. His arrest is going to have serious consequences, not just for you, but for this entire precinct." Brian's mind raced, trying to piece together what this meant. He had profiled and arrested an innocent man, a federal agent, no less, based on nothing more than his own biased assumptions. The enormity of his mistake began to settle in, bringing with it a cold, creeping dread. "I didn't know, Captain," Brian said, his voice shaky. "I didn't know who he was." "That's the problem, Harkins," Bennett replied, her tone still firm. "It shouldn't have mattered who he was. Your actions were based on assumptions and prejudices, not on any real evidence. You can't arrest someone just because they don't look like they belong in a park." Brian wanted to argue, to defend himself, but the words wouldn't come. Deep down, he knew Captain Bennett was right. He had let his biases guide his actions, and now he was facing the consequences. "What happens now?" Brian asked, his voice low, almost resigned. Captain Bennett sighed, leaning back in her chair. "For now, you're being placed on temporary leave while we investigate this incident. I've already spoken with the higher-ups, and they're not happy, to say the least. There will be an official review, and depending on the outcome, you could face disciplinary action up to and including termination." Brian's heart sank. Termination. The word hung in the air like a death sentence. He had been a cop for over 2 decades, and the thought of losing his badge was almost too much to bear. But as much as he wanted to deny it, he knew he had no one to blame but himself. "I understand, Captain," Brian finally said, his voice barely above a whisper. Bennett studied him for a moment, her expression softening slightly. "I know this isn't easy to hear, Harkins, but you need to understand that your actions have consequences, not just for you, but for the people you serve. We can't afford to have officers who let their biases dictate their decisions." Brian nodded, though his mind was still reeling. The reality of his situation was starting to sink in, and with it came a flood of regret. He had always prided himself on being a good cop, someone who upheld the law and protected the community. But now all of that was in jeopardy because of one careless, prejudiced decision. Captain Bennett stood up, signaling that the conversation was over. "You're dismissed, Officer Harkins. I'll notify you when the review is scheduled." Brian stood up as well, feeling the weight of the world on his shoulders. "Thank you, Captain," he mumbled before turning and walking out of the office. As he left the precinct, the familiar sights and sounds that had once brought him comfort now felt distant, almost alien. He walked to his car in a daze, the reality of his situation pressing down on him like a heavy fog. He had been a cop for so long that he didn't know who he was without the badge. The thought of losing it, of being branded as a failure, terrified him. But beneath the fear, there was something else, an unfamiliar sense of doubt. For the first time, Brian was forced to confront the fact that maybe, just maybe, he wasn't the upstanding officer he had always believed himself to be. That maybe he had let his biases and prejudices guide his actions more than he was willing to admit. As he drove home, the city streets passing by in a blur, Brian couldn't shake the image of Marcus Davis's calm, unflinching gaze. It was a look that had unsettled him from the start, and now he understood why Marcus had seen right through him, had known exactly what was happening even before Brian himself did. When Brian finally arrived home, he sat in his car for a long moment, staring at the steering wheel. The day's events played over and over in his mind, each repetition making the weight of his actions heavier. He didn't know what the future held, but he knew that his life had just changed irrevocably. With a heavy sigh, Brian got out of the car and walked into his house. The silence of the empty rooms pressed in on him as he sank into a chair, his thoughts a tangled mess of fear, regret, and uncertainty. For the first time in a long while, he didn't know what to do next. Captain Laura Bennett sat in her office, staring at the stack of reports on her desk. Each piece of paper represented a fragment of the truth she was trying to piece together. The internal investigation into Brian Harkin's conduct was underway, and it was her responsibility to ensure that every detail was thoroughly examined. She rubbed her temples, feeling the tension in her shoulders. The precinct had always prided itself on maintaining high standards, but this incident had shaken that foundation. As Captain Bennett continued to review the reports, she felt a deep sense of unease. She had known Brian for years. He had always been a solid officer. But this incident had exposed a side of him that she had never seen before. The hours passed slowly as Bennett continued to review the evidence. Finally, there was another knock at her door, and Harper entered, followed by Brian. "Come in, Harkins," Bennett said, keeping her voice neutral. Brian looked exhausted, his eyes dark with sleeplessness. He sat down across from Bennett, glancing nervously at Harper, who took a seat beside him. "We're going to go over the events of that day again," Bennett said, leaning forward slightly. "I need you to be completely honest with us, Brian. This is your chance to explain your side of the story." Brian nodded, but his expression was tight. "I understand, Captain." Bennett glanced at Harper, who started the questioning. "Brian, walk us through what was going through your mind when you first saw Marcus Davis in the park." Brian hesitated, his eyes shifting as he searched for the right words. "I saw a man who fit the description of the suspect we were looking for. It was a high-pressure situation, and I had to make a quick decision." "And what made you so sure he was the suspect?" Harper pressed. "He matched the description," Brian repeated, his voice more defensive now. "We were looking for a black male, around his height and build. He was acting suspiciously, like he was trying to hide something." Bennett could hear the strain in Brian's voice, the way he was grasping at justifications. "Brian, the witness statements and the body cam footage tell a different story. They show that Marcus Davis was cooperative, that he tried to explain who he was, but you didn't listen." Brian shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "He was trying to throw me off by time. I was just following my training, Captain. We're trained to be cautious, to assume that someone might be dangerous until proven otherwise. But did you consider that your assumptions might have been influenced by factors other than protocol?" the officer asked pointedly. Brian's throat tightened. He knew what they were getting at, and he knew there was no good answer. "I didn't mean to profile him," he said, his voice faltering slightly. "I was just doing my job." Marcus leaned forward slightly, his gaze still fixed on Brian. "Your job is to protect and serve, Officer Harkins, not to judge people based on their appearance." Brian met Marcus's eyes, and for a moment he felt a surge of defensiveness, but it was quickly followed by a wave of guilt. He had been in law enforcement long enough to know when he was wrong, and this was one of those times. "Captain Bennett," the judge said, addressing Jamal directly, "I want to thank you for your testimony. It's clear that you've been a dedicated father to your children, and it appears that much of the information presented by Miss Reynolds was, in fact, misleading." Hartman's words, though carefully measured, carried the weight of his own self-reflection. He wasn't just addressing Jamal, he was addressing himself. There was a deeper admission hidden beneath the judge's formal tone, an acknowledgement that he had been wrong from the start. The judge turned toward Lauren, who had remained eerily silent since Jamal's testimony. Her once confident posture had slumped, and she looked pale, her eyes darting around the courtroom as if she were searching for a way out of the mess she had created. "Miss Reynolds," Hartman said, his voice hardening, "you've made some very serious allegations against Mr. Williams, allegations that, as we've just seen, were not only false but deliberately misleading." The entire courtroom seemed to hold its breath as the judge's words hung in the air. Lauren shifted uncomfortably in her seat, her face flushing red under the pressure of the judge's scrutiny. She opened her mouth to speak but quickly closed it again, realizing that there was little she could say in her defense. "Not only have you falsely accused Mr. Williams of neglecting his responsibilities as a father," Hartman continued, "but you've also manipulated this court by hiding the truth about your own actions, particularly regarding the children's financial well-being." Draining their college fund for personal gain without the knowledge of the other parent is not just irresponsible, it's unconscionable. Lauren's eyes widened, and her lawyer looked visibly rattled, frantically flipping through his notes. But it was too late. The tide had turned, and there was no salvaging the lies that had been exposed. Hartman's gaze never wavered as he addressed Lauren, his voice colder now. "I have to say, Miss Reynolds, I'm deeply disappointed. You presented yourself as a struggling single mother, and I was inclined to believe you, but the facts we've uncovered today tell a very different story." The murmurs in the courtroom grew louder as people shifted in their seats, clearly surprised by how drastically the case had turned. The jurors exchanged glances, and even the court officers who had remained stoic throughout the trial seemed taken aback by the revelations. The narrative Lauren had carefully crafted was unraveling in front of their eyes, and there was no stopping the damage now. Lauren, for her part, sat frozen in her seat, her expression a mixture of fear and disbelief. For so long, she had controlled the story, manipulating the perception of others, making Jamal out to be the absent, irresponsible father. But now all of that had been destroyed. She had been exposed for what she was, a manipulator, someone who had used her privilege and society's biases to try to maintain control over a situation she couldn't handle. As the courtroom turned against her, there was a moment of raw vulnerability on Lauren's face, a brief flicker of something that might have been regret. But it passed quickly, replaced by the same cold indifference she had worn since the trial began. She wasn't going to break down in front of everyone. She wouldn't give them that satisfaction. But why had she done it? Why go to such lengths to tear Jamal down, to paint him as the villain when the truth was so different? Maybe it was jealousy, the simmering resentment that had built up over the years as she watched Jamal step up in ways she hadn't expected. He had become the father she had claimed he never could be, and that threatened the image she had created for herself, the image of the struggling, devoted mother who had been abandoned. Maybe it was an attempt to maintain her own privileged narrative, to ensure that she stayed the victim in the eyes of everyone around her, no matter the cost. Or perhaps it was something even deeper, a vindictiveness born from the knowledge that while Jamal had moved on, she hadn't. She hadn't been able to let go of the bitterness that had lingered after their separation, and so she had turned that bitterness into a weapon, using the court system and society's assumptions to try to punish him for her own unhappiness. Whatever the reason, it didn't matter anymore. The courtroom had seen the truth, and so had the judge. Hartman sighed, the weight of his own biases still heavy on his shoulders. This court will not tolerate false testimony or attempts to manipulate the justice system for personal gain, he said, his voice stern. Miss Reynolds, your actions today have not only wasted this court's time but have also harmed the very people you claim to be protecting, your children. The judge's words were final, echoing through the room with a sense of authority that left no room for argument. Lauren had been exposed, her lies laid bare for everyone to see, and there was no coming back from it. As the courtroom slowly began to settle, Jamal sat back in his chair, the tension in his shoulders easing for the first time in what felt like years. He had fought for the truth, and the truth had won. But more than that, he had shown the world, and more importantly, his children, that he wasn't the man Lauren had tried to make him out to be. The judge wasn't the only one who had to confront their biases today. The entire courtroom had been forced to see Jamal for who he really was, a loving, dedicated father who had fought for his children against all odds. And now, with Lauren's lies exposed, there was no denying the strength and resilience he had shown throughout the entire ordeal. Lauren, on the other hand, was left to face the consequences of her own actions. The image she had so carefully curated was shattered, and the courtroom's sympathy had shifted entirely away from her. Whatever her motives had been, they no longer mattered. What mattered now was the truth, and the truth had finally been revealed. The judge's final words echoed through the room as he prepared to adjourn the case. This court will now take a recess before rendering its final decision, but let it be clear, we do not condone falsehoods in the pursuit of personal vendettas. As the gavel came down, signaling the end of the session, Jamal closed his eyes for a brief moment, allowing himself to breathe. The hardest part was over, and the truth was out. He had won, not just the case, but the right to be seen for who he truly was, a father, a hero in his children's eyes, and that was all that mattered. Jamal glanced over at Lauren, who sat still in her seat, her face pale, her once confident posture deflated. She didn't meet his eyes, and for the first time, Jamal felt a pang of something close to pity for her. He had expected to feel triumphant, to bask in the victory of proving her wrong, but as he looked at her now, sitting there with her future uncertain, he realized that he didn't need to feel triumph over her downfall. The victory wasn't about Lauren, it was about his children and the life he had built for them. With the court adjourned, Jamal stood, shaking hands with his lawyer and exchanging a few words of gratitude. Maria had done an incredible job, but even she knew that this case was about more than just legal arguments. It had been about confronting deeply ingrained prejudices, and Jamal had risen above them all. He thanked her quietly, but he was eager to leave, eager to return to the people who mattered most, his children. As he walked out of the courtroom, the fresh air of the outside world hit him, and it felt like the first real breath he'd taken in months. Jamal had been fighting for so long, but now it was over. Now he could go back to what really mattered, being a father. His steps felt lighter, and despite everything, a smile broke across his face as he imagined the look on his children's faces when he returned home. This wasn't just about winning a case, it was about defying the stereotypes that had been placed on him from the moment he entered the courtroom, maybe even from the moment he had become a father. Society had tried to label him as another statistic, another absentee black father, but he had proven them wrong. And it wasn't just for himself, it was for his kids, for all the black fathers who faced the same unfair assumptions every day. Jamal arrived home later that afternoon, and as soon as he opened the door, he was greeted by the sound of laughter and the pitter-patter of little feet running toward him. His children threw themselves into his arms, their faces bright with excitement and love. "Daddy," they squealed, clinging to him as he hugged them close, feeling the warmth of their little bodies pressed against him. He bent down, wrapping his arms around them, closing his eyes as he took in the moment. This was his family. This was his life. For a long moment, Jamal just stood there, holding his children, feeling the love and connection that had kept him going through every grueling day of the trial. Nothing else mattered but this. Not the courtroom, not the lies, not the prejudices. Just them, just his kids, who had always known the truth about their father, even when the world tried to paint a different picture. The people who mattered most already knew the truth, and as long as his kids were happy, safe, and loved, that was all that mattered. Every so often, his mind wandered back to Lauren. He could have felt anger toward her, could have allowed the bitterness to take root. After all, she had lied, she had tried to tear him down, and she had used their children as pawns in a battle he never wanted to fight. But as he watched his kids giggle and chase each other around the room, Jamal realized something. He didn't have room for anger. He didn't have room for hate. His heart was too full of love for his children to waste it on anything else. Lauren's future was unclear, but that wasn't Jamal's concern. He knew there would be consequences for her actions, whether legal or personal, but that was for her to deal with. He didn't need to play a part in her downfall. He had bigger, more important things to focus on. Maybe one day she'd realize the damage she had caused, not just to Jamal, but to their children. Maybe one day she'd feel the weight of the choices she had made and seek some kind of redemption. But Jamal wasn't waiting for that. He wasn't holding on to the hope that she would change. He had done his part, he had fought the battle, and now it was time for him to focus on what truly mattered, being the best father he could be. That night, after tucking his kids into bed, Jamal sat on the porch, staring out at the quiet street. The sky was clear, and the stars twinkled faintly above him. It was a peaceful night, one that felt like the perfect reflection of the peace he finally felt inside. Jamal thought about everything that had happened. The courtroom, the lies, the prejudice he had faced, and he realized just how far he had come. This victory wasn't just about winning custody or proving that he was a good father, it was about overcoming something much bigger. He had faced down a system that had been set up to see him fail, and he had come out stronger on the other side. He thought back to the many moments throughout the trial when he had felt like giving up, when the weight of the world had felt too heavy. But he hadn't given up, he had fought, not for himself, but for his kids. And in the end, that was what had made the difference. As the cool night breeze swept over him, Jamal smiled softly to himself. He had won. not just in the courtroom but in life. He had proven to himself, to his children, and to the world that he was more than the stereotypes they had tried to box him into. He was a father, a strong, resilient father who had never stopped fighting for the people he loved most. And that, in the end, was all that mattered. As for Lauren, her world had come crashing down around her. Everything she had carefully constructed, the lies she had so meticulously woven together, had unraveled in front of everyone. The narrative she had spent months crafting, that of a struggling, devoted mother left to fend for herself while Jamal lived freely, had been exposed for what it was, a fabrication. And now the people she had so confidently manipulated were seeing her for who she truly was. Lauren's face was still warm from the flush of humiliation. She had been so sure, so certain that she could control this. She had walked into that courtroom with the same confidence that had carried her through most of her life, believing that her privilege, her ability to play the victim, and her manipulation of societal biases would be enough. But it hadn't worked. Instead, her lies had collapsed, and now she was left to face the fallout. Her plan had been so simple. At first, she had believed she could control the narrative, control the outcome. Jamal was an easy target, or so she thought. In her mind, the world was set up to believe women like her, mothers who claimed they were struggling, doing it all on their own. She had been sure that no one would question her story. After all, it was the one that people expected to hear. The bitterness inside her swelled, tightening its grip. How had it come to this? How had she, Lauren Reynolds, once the confident, vibrant woman who could charm her way through any situation, fallen so far? She thought about the beginning of her relationship with Jamal, how easy it had been to manipulate him, to make him feel small, to convince him that he was the problem. She had always been able to pull the strings to get what she wanted. But now she was the one dangling at the end of a rope she had tied herself. She had tried to ruin Jamal, and in the process, she had ruined herself. Her thoughts spiraled, filled with anger, shame, and something she didn't want to admit, regret, not for what she had done, no, that was too far buried beneath her pride, but for the fact that she hadn't been smarter about it. How had she allowed herself to be caught? How had she let Jamal, of all people, come out on top? She gritted her teeth, her hands shaking as she walked down the street. She had to figure out what to do next, how to fix this, how to salvage what little dignity she had left. But every time she thought about moving forward, she was met with the reality that she had burned too many bridges. The legal system would watch her closely now. The financial fallout from her actions would haunt her, and her relationships, what few she had left, were fractured beyond repair. Her thoughts drifted back to the children. For a brief moment, an image of their innocent faces flashed in her mind, and a pang of guilt cut through her bitterness. She had betrayed them too. She had used them, weaponized their future for her own gain. But the guilt was fleeting, quickly replaced by her simmering resentment toward Jamal. In her mind, it was his fault. He had been the one to put her in this position. If he had just stayed in the background, played his part, this would have gone smoothly. But no, he had to fight. He had to prove her wrong. He had to win. Lauren's bitterness turned inward, twisting into a dark knot that settled deep in her chest. She couldn't let go of her anger. She couldn't face the reality that she had been the architect of her own downfall. And now, all she had left was that anger, that resentment clinging to her like a second skin. The days that followed were a blur of legal meetings, tense phone calls, and sleepless nights. Lauren tried to move on, tried to pick up the pieces of her life, but everywhere she turned, she was reminded of her failure. Friends, once sympathetic to her plight, now kept their distance, unsure of how to approach her. The court had ordered her to repay the funds she had taken from the children's account, and with her financial situation in disarray, she was left scrambling to find a way to fix the mess she had created. Her relationship with the children became strained, her visits awkward and tense. They were old enough to sense that something was wrong, old enough to understand that their mother wasn't the person she had pretended to be. They gravitated toward Jamal, seeking comfort and stability from the parent who had always been there for them. And that stung more than Lauren was willing to admit. She had always believed she would win, that her children would choose her, that they would see her as the hero in their lives. But now they looked at her with confusion, with distance, and sometimes with something that looked dangerously close to disappointment. Lauren's bitterness consumed her, but it also left her hollow. She was stuck in the wreckage of her own making, unable to move forward but unwilling to let go. She could have chosen to be a better person, to acknowledge her mistakes and try to rebuild what had been lost. But that wasn't who Lauren was. She couldn't admit defeat, couldn't face the reality that she had been wrong. And so she remained stuck, her future ambiguous, uncertain. The world had moved on. Jamal had moved on, and her children were finding happiness without her. She had always wanted control, but now she had lost control of everything. And as she sat alone in her apartment, staring blankly at the walls, Lauren realized something she had never been willing to admit before. She had destroyed everything she had ever cared about, and she had no one to blame but herself.